In the late 13th century BC, the ancient world stood on the brink of chaos. Once great palaces and cities across the Mediterranean were about to fall silent, ushering in a dark age. From the fertile Nile Delta to the fortress cities of Anatolia and the Levant, civilizations trembled as mysterious invaders appeared from the sea. Egyptian scribes would later describe a confederation of marauders, northern countries coming in warships, that seemed to attack all at once, toppling kingdoms one by one. These enigmatic raiders are known today as the Sea Peoples, and their onslaught coincided with the cataclysmic Late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC. To understand the impact of the Sea Peoples, we first need to picture the vibrant world they entered. Around 1300 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean was a thriving international system. Great kingdoms like Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, and Babylon were linked by trade, diplomacy, and war. Pharaohs and kings addressed each other as brother in elegant letters, exchanging gifts of gold, spices, and princesses. Archaeology vividly confirms this connectivity. The famous Uluburun shipwreck from around 1300 BC carried cargo from at least 7 different lands: Cypriot copper, Afghan tin, African ivory, Levantine cedar, Egyptian glass, Mycenaean jewelry, all on one ship. This was a globalized Bronze Age economy, as historian Eric Klein describes it, where each region's prosperity depended on far-flung trade partners. Politically, palace-centered economies ruled the day. In places like Mycenae, Ugarit, and Hattusa, wealth flowed into royal storehouses and was redistributed to loyal elites and temples. This system yielded impressive achievements: monumental temples, fortresses, and the spread of writing systems. But it was also fragile. A palace might stockpile grain and bronze weapons for its army, but if trade routes failed or harvests faltered, the centralized system had few reserves. Additionally, the Late Bronze Age was a time of large standing armies and chariot warfare, maintained at great expense by the ruling class. Alliances and rivalries abounded. For example, Egypt and the Hittites, former foes at the Battle of Kadesh, 1274 BC, eventually signed a peace and even exchanged royal family members in marriage. Meanwhile, smaller states like those in Canaan toiled as vassals, paying tribute and sending troops to their imperial overlords. By the late 1200s BC, however, signs of strain were emerging across this interconnected world. Letters from Ugarit, in today's Syria, and Hatti, central Anatolia, speak of famine and pleas for grain. Climate data suggests that around 1250 BC a severe drought began, one of the worst of the Bronze Age. Crops failed in many areas, causing shortages even in wealthy ports like Ugarit, which had once been a major grain transshipment center. One Egyptian letter, from Pharaoh Merneptah to Ugarit, records the Ugaritic ruler begging for food. "There is a severe hunger. May the king give grain to save my life and the citizens of Ugarit." Plague and internal conflicts hit some kingdoms as well. The Hittite annals mention a time of plague and rebellion in their last decades, and crucially, as each kingdom struggled, their interdependence turned into a weakness. When one fell, it disrupted trade for the others, in a domino effect. Around 1200 BC, the Late Bronze Age collapse unfolded as a cascade of disasters. Nearly every major palace center between Greece and Babylon was destroyed or abandoned in the span of a few decades. In Greece, the Mycenaean palaces, Mycenae, Pylos, Thebes, and others, were burned or fell into ruin by 1180 BC, marking the end of Linear B writing and the start of a Greek Dark Age. In Anatolia, the mighty Hittite Empire simply disappears from history after its capital, Hattusa, was burned and deserted around this time. One Hittite site shows haunting evidence. At Karaolen near Ankara, skeletons lay unburied in the rubble of burned buildings, a grim snapshot of sudden collapse. The rich trading cities of Cyprus and the Levant were hit as well, and Komi in Cyprus, a prosperous port, met violent destruction around 1200 BC. In the Levant, cities like Megiddo and Hazor show thick destruction layers around the early 12th century BC, indicating intense fires and warfare. As far south as Canaan and Egypt's borderlands, longtime Egyptian garrison towns were overrun or abandoned. Ancient observers struggled to understand the catastrophe. Later, Greek legends spoke of a Dorian invasion in Greece or the fall of Troy, usually dated around this era, but the only near-contemporary records come from Egyptian inscriptions and a handful of letters in the Near East, and these point to invasions and upheaval from abroad. Egyptian texts from the reigns of Pharaoh Merneptah, circa 1213 to 1203 BC, and Ramesses III, circa 1184 to 1153 BC, describe assaults by foreign peoples from the north, both by land and sea. At Ugarit, an Ugaritic letter famously warns of unknown attackers. The enemy's ships came, here, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. In that same letter, King Amurapi of Ugarit lamented that he was defenseless. His troops were away with the Hittites and his navy was off in Cyprus, leaving the country abandoned to itself as invaders closed in. Archaeology confirms Ugarit's desperate end. The city was violently destroyed and never rebuilt. Excavations revealed ash layers, collapsed buildings, arrowheads, and even hastily buried hoards of valuables, as if the inhabitants tried to hide their treasures from looters. Multiple factors likely converged in this collapse. Modern scholars speak of a perfect storm. Mega droughts, famine, internal rebellions, earthquakes, and invading migrations all hit one after another. Pollen records and lake sediments show a sharp dry climate episode between 1250 to 1100 BC, a 150-year drought in some regions, which would have led to repeated crop failures. Famine inevitably followed drought. Notably, the worst famine years match the timing of major sea peoples' incursions. Some researchers also point to an earthquake storm, a cluster of major quakes around 1225 to 1175 BC that could have leveled cities or weakened defenses in places like Troy, Mycenae, or the Levant. While no single cause explains everything, the combination of these disasters was devastating. As Eric Klein puts it, any one crisis might not topple civilization, but if you get 3 or 4 in quick succession, that's when you have a perfect storm, and there's no time to recover. Into this volatile mix came the groups we call sea peoples, perhaps both agents and products of the chaos. They are often cast as ancient villains, the marauders who burned cities and ended the Bronze Age. Indeed, early historians like Gaston Maspero in the 19th century popularized the idea that wave upon wave of sea peoples' invasions caused the collapse. But today, the picture is more nuanced. Many scholars now view the sea peoples as both a cause and a consequence of the collapse. They may have been opportunistic raiders capitalizing on weakened states, or desperate migrants fleeing their own fallen homelands, or a bit of both. Were they villains or victims of this age of turmoil? The answer, as we'll see, is still debated. Our clearest window into the sea people's identity comes from the records of New Kingdom Egypt, which uniquely survived the Bronze Age collapse, albeit in a weakened state. The pharaohs Merneptah and Ramesses III left dramatic accounts of fighting off these invaders. In fact, the term sea peoples itself stems from these Egyptian records, particularly a phrase peoples of the sea, inscribed by Pharaoh Ramesses III to describe several of the defeated groups. The first Egyptian encounter came earlier than the main collapse. Pharaoh Ramesses II, the great ruler of the 13th century BC, recorded a battle against sea raiders in year 2 of his reign, approximately 1278 BC. An inscription from Ramesses II describes how pirates called the Sherden attacked the Nile Delta in force. The unruly Sherden, whom no one had ever known how to combat, they came boldly sailing in their warships from the midst of the sea, none being able to withstand them. Ramesses II claims he defeated and even captured many Sherden, and intriguingly, he then enlisted those captives into his own elite guard. This suggests the Sherden were formidable warriors, so much so that the pharaoh preferred to have them fighting with him rather than against him. Indeed, Sherden mercenaries later fought for Egypt at the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites. We also have hints that Sherden were present in the Levant decades before the collapse. The Amarna letters, 14th century tablets, may mention a Sherdenu serving as a mercenary or bandit in Canaan. All this shows that sea peoples groups were on the move well before 1200 BC, raiding or hiring out their swords, and not just appearing overnight during the collapse. Fast forward to 1210 to 1208 BC, the reign of Pharaoh Merneptah Ramesses II's son. Egypt was invaded from the west by a Libyan chieftain and his allies, and among those allies were foreign names that match the Sea Peoples. Merneptah's inscriptions, the Great Karnak inscription and the Athribis stele, recount a great battle in Libya, where the pharaoh crushed a coalition of Libyans joined by warriors from the north. He specifically lists Eqesh of the countries of the sea, Lucca, Shekelesh, Sherden, and Teresh, as peoples fighting alongside the Libyan king Merieh. Merneptah boasts of slaying hundreds of these Sea Peoples mercenaries. Some 200+ Shekelesh were killed, according to the text. This battle in year 5 of Merneptah, circa 1208 BC, is one of the earliest solid records of multiple Sea Peoples tribes operating together. It shows that by the late 13th century, bands of Sherden, Shekelesh, Lucca, Teresh, and others were willing to migrate or venture far, even into North Africa, as armed groups. Perhaps they were attracted by promises of plunder or land from the Libyan leader, or driven by hardships at home. Merneptah's victory staved off disaster for Egypt in the short term. On the famous Merneptah stele he erected to commemorate his campaigns, better known for the first mention of Israel in Canaan, Merneptah also implied Egypt's north frontiers were secure, yet this was only a prelude, for a much larger confrontation loomed a generation later. Around 1177 BC, during the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses III, the Sea Peoples launched an even more massive assault, an event that Ramesses III documented in detail on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu in Thebes. The reliefs and hieroglyphic texts there read like an ancient war epic. They describe a coalition of Sea Peoples moving south through the eastern Mediterranean, devastating everything in their path. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. Ramesses III's inscriptions name several tribes in this coalition: Peleset, Tjekker, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshesh, and others, coming from the sea, or from their isles. Around year 8 of Ramesses III, approximately 1175 BC, these Sea Peoples attempted a dual invasion of Egypt, one on land, through Canaan, the Battle of Jahi, and one by sea into the Nile Delta, the Battle of the Delta. The Medinet Habu reliefs dramatically show the sea battle, Egyptian warships ramming enemy vessels, while on shore Egyptian archers rain arrows on invaders whose boats are capsizing. The Sea Peoples warriors are depicted with distinctive gear. Many wear feathered or horned helmets and carry round shields and spears. Their boats have high prow decorations shaped like bird heads, unlike any Egyptian vessel. One carving even shows families in ox-drawn carts following the Sea Peoples army, men, women, and children on the move. This indicates we are not just seeing strike forces of pirates, but whole communities migrating, which is a critical clue to their nature. Ramesses III claims a complete victory. His text boasts that he destroyed their fleet, captured or killed countless Sea Peoples, and settled the survivors in strongholds, bound in my name, possibly as captive laborers or mercenaries in Canaan. Indeed, Papyrus Harris, a record of Ramesses III's reign, also recounts that after defeating them, the pharaoh allowed some Sea Peoples to settle in fortresses under his authority. Egypt, thus, was one of the few places to successfully repel the Sea Peoples, though the effort strained the kingdom. After Ramesses III's death, Egypt's power sharply declined. It withdrew from its Asiatic territories, leaving places like Canaan open for new peoples, such as the Philistines and Israelites, to emerge. The Egyptian records, triumphalist in tone, naturally present the Sea Peoples as a marauding horde decisively beaten by Pharaoh, but modern historians read them more critically, cross-checking with archaeological evidence. We know, for example, that many Sea Peoples did not simply vanish after these battles. Some settled in the Levant and became part of the region's new ethnic landscape, the Peleset/Philistines being the prime example, as we'll explore next. Moreover, Egyptian art shows the Sea Peoples as diverse groups, each with distinct costumes and weapons, suggesting this was not a single unified army in uniform, but a loose confederation of different tribes joining forces. Ancient reliefs depict Sherden fighters with horned helmets and short swords, Peleset, Philistines, with feathered headdresses and long spears, Shekelesh and Denyen with other unique attire. This diversity hints that the Sea Peoples may have had different origins and agendas, coming together perhaps out of shared desperation or opportunism rather than as a permanent allied nation. Indeed, one theory posits that some were mercenaries hired by failing states, while others were displaced migrants. Their unity may have been temporary or coincidental. Egyptian records list 9 or more names for these Sea Peoples groups. Each name represents a tribe or people whose original homeland and fate have been the subject of much detective work by historians. While there is no scholarly consensus, here are the major Sea Peoples tribes as known from inscriptions, and the prevailing theories about them. Sherden, Shardana. Sherden warriors appear the most frequently in records and art, often shown with horned helmets and broad swords. They were first defeated by Ramesses II in 1278 BC, and later fought both against and for Egypt. Clues to their origin come from the similarity of Sherden to the name Sardinia. Archaeologists have indeed noted parallels between Sherden artifacts, like their swords and armor, and the Nuragic culture of Sardinia. In a compelling find, Nuragic Sardinian pottery from the 12th century BC was excavated at a fortress site in Cyprus, implying some Sardinian-linked people were present in the eastern Mediterranean at the time of the collapse. This bolsters the idea that some Sherden may have originated in Sardinia or had ties there. It's possible the Sherden were sailors and warriors from the central Mediterranean, perhaps Sardinia or nearby islands, who roamed eastward as mercenaries or pirates. Some of the defeated Sherden, Ramesses III claims, were settled by him in Canaan. One hypothesis even suggests Sherden mercenaries ended up in the service of Canaanite cities like Megiddo after 1175 BC. While not all scholars agree on a Sardinian origin, the onomastic and archaeological evidence makes it a strong theory. Thus, the Sherden could represent a Western Mediterranean element among the Sea Peoples, bringing Nuragic-style items and perhaps seeking new lands. Shekelesh. The Shekelesh are mentioned as allies of the Libyans in Merneptah's campaign, circa 1208 BC, and again under Ramesses III. Their name has long invited comparison with Sicily, the ancient Sicily people. Many historians hypothesize the Shekelesh had some connection to Sicily or southern Italy. Perhaps they hailed from Sicily originally, or alternatively, that they eventually settled there after roaming, the historical record does note, upheavals in Sicily in the post-1200 BC period. The evidence is mostly linguistic. The root shekel resembles Shekele, and a Hittite letter possibly refers to a seafaring people Shekala, which could be related. No definitive archaeological trail of the Shekelesh has been found, but given Sicily's strategic position, it's conceivable that some groups from the Central Med joined the Sea Peoples coalition. In Egyptian art, the Shekelesh were not illustrated distinctly, or not enough to identify, but as Sea Peoples they likely fought with similar gear. In summary, the Shekelesh might represent an Italic connection, and their very presence in Egypt's records hints that the destabilization of the Western Mediterranean, Italy, Sicily, was feeding into the larger collapse. Peleset. The Peleset are almost universally identified with the Philistines known from the Bible and later history. After Ramesses III's battles, Egyptian texts explicitly mention Peleset prisoners or settlers in southern Canaan. Indeed, Ramesses III claims to have made the Peleset settle in strongholds, bound in my name in Canaan after defeating them. Within a few decades after 1175 BC, a distinct Philistine culture arose on the southwest coast of the Levant, in what is today Gaza, Israel, centered on 5 cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. Archaeology shows that around circa 1175 to 1150 BC, these cities saw the arrival of new pottery styles, called Philistine ware, related to Mycenaean, Greek designs, and new foods and burial practices distinct from local Canaanite traditions. Recent DNA analysis of skeletons from early Iron Age Ashkelon even indicates that a portion of the population had European ancestry, likely from the southern European Aegean region. This genetic evidence, coupled with the material culture, strongly suggests the Peleset/Philistines were immigrants from the Aegean world settling in Canaan. They may have been Mycenaean Greek refugees or mercenaries, possibly those who had raided with the Sea Peoples and then found a new home on the coast. However, both DNA and artifacts also show that these newcomers blended quickly with the local people, adopting Canaanite language and customs over the next century. As archaeologist Aaron Mayer remarks, the Philistines likely formed through a series of mass migrations rather than a single wave of conquest, becoming a hybrid culture by settling among Canaanites. So the Peleset/Philistines illustrate how one Sea People group transitioned from invaders to settlers, leaving a lasting legacy. Their name even survives in the toponym Palestine. They went from being Egypt's foes to dominating parts of the southern Levant during the Iron Age. Tjekker, or Sikil. The Tjekker are known from Egyptian records, and notably from the story of Wenamun, an Egyptian tale set around 1100 BC. In that story, an Egyptian priest travels to the Levantine port of Dor and finds it ruled by a Tjekker prince, indicating the Tjekker had settled at Dor in modern Israel after the collapse. Ramesses III's inscriptions list the Tjekker among the Sea Peoples defeated in battle. Later, by the mid-12th century, the Tjekker evidently carved out their own city-state at Dor. They likely arrived by sea as part of the Sea Peoples movements. Their origin is debated. Some scholars suggest their name, Tjekker Sikil, hints at a link with Crete or the Aegean, perhaps related to Teucer or Teucrians, a mythical Trojan people. In fact, one theory connected them to the Teucri of northwest Anatolia near Troy. However, historian Trevor Bryce dismisses that as pure speculation. Another idea is that Sikil is related to Sicily, similar to Shekelesh, causing some confusion in terminology. Without clear evidence, the Tjekker remains somewhat mysterious. What is clear is their presence in Palestine's coastal region, contributing to the new social landscape. Excavations at Tel Dor show a sudden change in material culture in the 12th century BC, consistent with an incoming group, possibly the Tjekker, who fortified the site and built in a different style. The Tjekker remind us that the Sea Peoples didn't only pass through, some stayed and became local powers. Denyen, Danuna, or Danaoi. The Denyen were another prominent group in the Sea Peoples coalition defeated by Ramesses III. Their name is tantalizingly similar to two things: the word Danaoi, one of Homer's terms for the Greeks in the Iliad, and the Danuna, a people mentioned in texts from Syria, Cilicia. Many researchers have tentatively linked the Denyen to the ancient Greeks in some way. It's possible that the Denyen were originally Mycenaean Greeks, Achaeans, who had turned to raiding after their palaces fell. Alternatively, they might have been from the eastern Mediterranean, in later Assyrian records. Circa 8th century BC, there was a kingdom called Kwe, Adanawa, in Cilicia, southeast Turkey, whose rulers claimed descent from the Danuna. This raises the possibility that some Denyen settled in that area, the plain of Adana, after the collapse, or were originally from there. Interestingly, the Hebrew Bible mentions a tribe of Dan that migrated by sea and settled in the north of Israel. Judges 5 and Joshua 19 hint at Danite seafaring. A few scholars have speculated a connection between the Denyen and the Dan, i.e., that a branch of Denyen became the tribe of Dan in biblical tradition. While speculative, it underscores that Denyen could have integrated into various eastern Mediterranean populations. On balance, the Denyen likely represent a Mycenaean diaspora element among the Sea Peoples, given the Greek Danaoi parallel. They too were described by Egyptians as coming in their isles, implying an origin from islands or coastal lands across the sea. Ekwesh. The Ekwesh are only explicitly named in Merneptah's records as Ekwesh of the Sea. The name Ekwesh is strongly suspected to correspond to Achaeans, the most common Homeric name for the Greeks. If this is correct, it is direct evidence that Mycenaean Greeks, or at least people from somewhere in the Aegean, were numbered among the Sea Peoples who fought Egypt. Merneptah, claiming to have defeated the Ekwesh, suggests that some Greek warriors, perhaps mercenaries, exiles, or adventurers, were operating alongside other Sea Peoples in the late 13th century. Considering that the fall of Greece's palaces circa 1200 BC would have displaced many trained fighters, it makes sense that some turned to raiding abroad. The Ekwesh likely did not remain as a distinct group in the Near East after the invasions. They perhaps merged with other populations or returned west. But their presence is a key piece of evidence linking the upheavals in the Aegean with those in the Near East. Essentially, Ekwesh equals Achaean Greeks is the theory that most scholars favor, making them another Greek contingent in the Sea Peoples Confederation. Luca. The Luca, or Luca, were known even before the collapse as the people of Lycia in southwest Anatolia. They appear in Hittite records as a seafaring, sometimes rebellious group on the Anatolian coast. Egyptian records under Ramesses II and III mention the Luca as among their foes and allies of other sea peoples. It's likely that some of the sea peoples originated not from the sea islands, but from Anatolian coastal peoples like the Luca. When the Hittite Empire started to crumble, the Luca may have seized the moment to strike out for loot or new territory. Some Luca could have joined the migration southward that menaced Ugarit in Cyprus, as Ugaritic letters imply enemies were also coming from the direction of Luca's land. After the dust settled, Lycia itself reconstituted as a Neo-Hittite kingdom, but references to Luca as pirates persist into later eras. They underscore that Anatolia's collapse was part of the Sea Peoples phenomenon. Groups like the Luca contributed to the turmoil both as instigators and refugees. Teresh, Tertia. The Teresh are listed by Merneptah and Ramesses III. This name is often linked to Tyrsonoi, the Greek name for the Etruscans of Italy, or to Troas, Troy, in Anatolia. One theory posits the Teresh were originally from the region of Troy or western Anatolia, possibly connected to the people who later became the Etruscans in Italy. There is a classical tradition that says the Etruscans' ancestors emigrated from Anatolia, specifically Lydia, around the time of the Trojan War. It's tempting to imagine the Teresh as Trojans or their kin, fleeing the fall of Troy. Troy 7a was destroyed roughly 1190 BC, and joining the Sea Peoples on the move. Another interpretation is that Teresh equals Tyrrhenians, an umbrella term Greeks used for certain Sea Peoples, and later for Etruscans. While evidence is thin, finds of late Bronze Anatolian artifacts in Italy hint at some movement of people. At any rate, Egyptian scribes considered the Teresh of the sea like the others. They do not reappear in Iron Age texts, so presumably they either settled and blended into existing groups or perished in conflicts. The Teresh symbolize the possible link between the Sea Peoples and the wider Mediterranean, including Europe, beyond just the Eastern Med. They remind us that the collapse reverberated as far west as Italy. Weshesh. The Weshesh, or Uashesh, are among the least known. Ramesses III mentions them, but no distinctive dress or iconography is attached to them. They might have been a smaller clan or simply one that left no separate archaeological traces. Some speculate a link to Wilusa, the Hittite name for Troy, or some Aegean island people, but this is conjecture. The Weshesh could have been integrated into other groups. Interestingly, an old theory connected Weshesh with the biblical tribe of Asher on the North Canaan coast, but that is far from proven. Given the scarcity of data, the Weshesh remain mysterious, a placeholder name for one more lost tribe that took part in the upheaval. In summary, the Sea Peoples Confederation appears to have been a mix of peoples from different regions, some from the Aegean and Greek world, Ekwesh, Denyen, maybe Peleset, some from the central Mediterranean, Sherden, Shekelesh, Teresh, and some from Anatolia, Luca, possibly Tjekker. They were likely not united until circumstances brought them into alignment against the existing powers. Linguistic clues, tribal names resembling geographic names, and archaeological finds, pottery styles, weapons, DNA, all support the idea that widespread migrations were happening. One scholar described the Sea Peoples not as a monolithic nation, but mixed ethnic groups who banded together after their own cities declined, roaming in search of new homes. This coalition was probably fluid, forming, dispersing, and reforming as they moved along the coasts. The presence of women and children in their trek, as seen in Egyptian reliefs, further indicates many were migrants or refugees as much as warriors. They fought fiercely, but perhaps out of necessity rather than pure conquest, as one view holds. With their identities now outlined, let's turn to the physical evidence of their passage, the ruined cities and clues left behind. The Late Bronze Age collapse and the Sea Peoples' passage left a trail of destruction in the archaeological record. By examining key sites that were affected, cities that were destroyed or abandoned, we can better grasp the scale of upheaval and sometimes even link the damage to these invaders or migrants. Here are a few notable case studies. Ugarit, northern Syrian coast. The demise of Ugarit is often seen as a hallmark of the collapse. This wealthy port city was burned to the ground around 1190 BC and never reoccupied. French excavations in the 1920s uncovered dramatic evidence of Ugarit's final days. In addition to charred buildings and debris, archaeologists found clay tablets in kilns, including the letters from King Amurapi that were never sent because the city fell so suddenly. One letter from Amurapi to the king of Alashia, Cyprus, reads like a cry of doom. "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us." The fact that these tablets were preserved by the fire, baked hard in the conflagration, is eerie. It means the attack happened as correspondence was in progress. Excavation revealed a thick layer of ash and soot over the ruins, arrowheads and weapons lying in the streets, and even treasures hidden in pots or buried under floors, presumably last-ditch efforts by inhabitants to protect their valuables from looters. Who destroyed Ugarit? The letters strongly suggest maritime raiders, likely the Sea Peoples, were the culprits. One letter from a Ugaritic official urgently states that enemy ships had been sighted and pleas for help. It appears help never arrived in time. Ugarit's destruction was so complete that its location was forgotten until modern times. The fall of Ugarit shows the sudden breakdown of trade and communication. This was a city that traded with Cyprus, Egypt, and the Aegean, and its ruin severed those links. Ugarit also underscores that the Sea People's attacks extended beyond Egypt and deep into the Levant. Hattusa, capital of the Hittites, central Anatolia. The fortified city of Hattusa was the center of the Hittite Empire. Sometime around 1200 to 1180 BC, Hattusa was violently destroyed and abandoned. Archaeologists found a destruction layer with burnt wood and collapsed brick, although the site's partial excavation leaves some questions. It's not fully clear who or what destroyed Hattusa. Possibilities include internal revolt, northern barbarians, Kaskan tribes, or perhaps forces related to the Sea Peoples. There is evidence the city was already under strain. Hittite records in the final years mention famine, invasions at the fringes, and civil strife. One intriguing Hittite tablet recounts that Suppiluliuma II, the last known Hittite king, fought naval battles against Alashia, Cyprus, and won shortly before Hattusa fell. This suggests that the Hittites themselves were trying to suppress unrest in their western territories and islands, perhaps facing some of the same peoples that would later hit Egypt. In the end, Hattusa's palaces were torched, and the site was left desolate. Later Iron Age people even thought it was haunted ruins. Did the Sea Peoples reach Hattusa? We have no direct record of it, but it's notable that the Luca and Karkisha, likely Carian, who allied with Sea Peoples were former Hittite subjects. If not directly by Sea Peoples, Hattusa might have fallen to related uprisings, propelled by the same regional chaos. Within a few years of Hattusa's fall, the entire Hittite political system fractured. Independent Neo-Hittite city-states emerged in the southern regions, but the empire was gone. The destruction of Hattusa marks the definitive end of an era in Anatolia, and like Ugarit's fall, it coincides with the Sea People's rampage across the map. Cyprus, Alashia. The wealthy copper-producing island of Cyprus faced devastation at multiple sites around 1200 BC. The city of Enkomi, for example, was destroyed, though some of its population survived to rebuild a smaller settlement in the Iron Age. Excavations at Enkomi and nearby Kidian show buildings violently destroyed, and in one layer a woman's skeleton was found crushed under a collapsed wall, a victim of sudden calamity. Interestingly, after these events, the culture on Cyprus changes. Mycenaean-style pottery and writing, Cypro-Greek dialect, become prominent, indicating an influx of Aegean people. This aligns with the idea that some Sea Peoples, possibly Denyen or Ekwesh or others, ended up settling Cyprus. One Cypriot letter found in Ugarit's ruins is a reply from the governor of Alashia denying responsibility for raids and cryptically saying, "Your own people did this," perhaps hinting at turmoil and treachery involving Cypriot factions. In any case, Cyprus's cities burned around the same time as those on the mainland, showing the truly regional scope of the collapse. Ashkelon and Philistia, southern Canaan, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza. These 5 cities in the southwest Levant are the heartland where the Philistines, Peleset, took root. Ashkelon in particular provides a rich archaeological record. Around 1200 to 1175 BC, Ashkelon's Canaanite city shows evidence of destruction and abrupt change. In the layers immediately after, archaeologists found pottery of Aegean styles, so-called Philistine bichrome ware and earlier Mycenaean IIIC forms, and pig bones in diet where previously there were few, both signs of a new cultural group arriving. A notable discovery in 2016 to 2019 was a cemetery at Ashkelon from the early 12th century BC containing individuals whose DNA indicated Southern European ancestry, confirming that newcomers from the Aegean were present. These would be the Philistines in their initial generation. It appears Ashkelon was taken over rather than completely razed. Possibly the Egyptians withdrew their garrison, and the Sea Peoples, Philistines, moved in and became the dominant community. The material culture shows a blend over time. By the 11th century BC, Philistine pottery incorporates local Canaanite motifs, reflecting acculturation. Ekron and Ashdod similarly show the appearance of Philistine pottery and architecture, like new brewery installations and courtyard houses, soon after 1200 BC. This is clear archaeological evidence tying one Sea People group, Peleset, to a permanent settlement and the birth of a new nation in the Iron Age. It also illustrates how quickly the void left by the collapse was filled by enterprising survivors, in this case Sea Peoples who transitioned from destroyers to builders of a new society. Dor, northern Canaan coast. At Tel Dor, archaeologists noted a violent destruction layer at the end of the Bronze Age, followed by reconstruction in the early Iron Age with different building styles and ceramics. This correlates with the presence of the Tjekker, as mentioned earlier. Dor's strategic harbor would have attracted Sea Peoples, and indeed it became a Tjekker stronghold. Excavations found imported pottery and artifacts suggesting a link with the Aegean and Cyprus, hinting that Dor's new masters were of foreign origin. The site offers a microcosm of how a Sea People group could take over a city, fortify it, and establish themselves as local rulers, the Egyptian. Wenamun's tale confirms a man called Bader in Dor ruling as a Tjekker chief. Dor's story is one of continuity through change. The city wasn't permanently abandoned, but its population likely changed composition due to incoming Sea Peoples. Megiddo and the southern Levant. Many inland sites in the southern Levant, modern Israel, Palestine, Jordan, show destruction around the late 13th or early 12th century BC, though attributing these to Sea Peoples specifically is tricky. Megiddo, a major Canaanite city, was destroyed by fire in the early 11th century BC. It may have been due to internal revolt or invasion. Some scholars think Sea Peoples, perhaps Sherden or others settled nearby, could have sacked Megiddo. Interestingly, an Egyptian letter from about 1100 BC, the Papyrus Harris or other records, suggests that Sherden were settled in the Megiddo region by the pharaoh's orders. If so, what happened at Megiddo might involve those mercenaries turning on their overlords or being caught in later conflicts. The broader pattern in the Levant is that coastal cosmopolitan cities fell, while some smaller inland villages survived or emerged, possibly those, became early Israelite settlements in the highlands, which were less directly hit by the chaos. Each site's destruction has its unique aspects, but together they paint a picture of a systemic collapse. From Greece to Turkey to Syria to Canaan, cities burned and were abandoned in a narrow time window. However, archaeology also urges caution. Not every site traditionally thought to have been destroyed in 1200 BC actually was, or at least not by violence. Recent research by archaeologists like Jesse Millick has re-examined many sites and found that some destruction layers were misdated or non-existent. For example, sites like Byblos, Sidon, Tyre in Lebanon appear to have survived into the Iron Age without a clear destruction at 1200 BC. This suggests the collapse, while widespread, was uneven. Some places escaped the worst, possibly by adapting or by sheer luck. The Phoenician cities, like Tyre and Sidon, actually flourished soon after, filling the trade vacuum left by others. So we must imagine the collapse as a complex mosaic: coastal raiding and migrating bands, sea peoples ravaging some areas, internal revolts in others, and climate-induced famine weakening many from within. The sea peoples were a major thread in this tapestry of collapse, but not the only one. When the storms of the early 12th century BC finally subsided, the political landscape of the eastern Mediterranean had been utterly transformed. In place of the old great powers, a patchwork of new peoples and states emerged, and among these, the legacy of the sea peoples is clearly visible. In the Levant, as we discussed, the Philistines, Peleset, established themselves as a significant force. By around 1150 BC, Philistia, the coastal plain of southern Canaan, was a thriving entity with its 5 cities. Engaged in trade, they had distinctive pottery, but also were making olive oil and wine, etc. They are frequently mentioned in the Hebrew Bible as antagonists of the Israelites in the succeeding centuries. The Philistines preserved some memory of their foreign origins. For instance, biblical texts link them to Kaftir, possibly Crete, or a generic term for the Aegean. Culturally, they eventually blended into the Levant, but some Aegean-inspired practices, like feasting styles and worship of gods such as Dagon, lingered. The Tjekker at Dor likely persisted for some time as a small sea principality, until absorbed by others, perhaps by the expanding Israelites or Phoenicians later. Further north, along the Syrian coast, new Aramaean tribes and Neo-Hittite city-states filled the vacuum left by Ugarit and the Hittites. For example, Carchemish on the Euphrates survived and became a center of a Neo-Hittite kingdom, and new Aramaean-led states like Aram-Damascus emerged in inland Syria. It seems the sea peoples did not settle much in those northern areas, aside from possible Denyen Cilicians in southeast Turkey. Instead, local populations took over and rebuilt in a world where the old hierarchies were gone. In Egypt, the aftermath of Ramesses III's victories saw Egypt itself turn inward. By 1100 BC, Egypt had lost its Asiatic provinces entirely. The pharaohs of the following dynasties were weaker, and Egypt faced its own internal decline. The new kingdom gave way to a period of fragmentation. However, Egypt's encounters with the sea peoples did have some lasting effects. Some Sherden and other sea peoples were incorporated into Egyptian society as mercenaries or even as communities. For instance, skeletons with European traits have been found in New Kingdom Egyptian tomb contexts, possibly those of Sherden warriors who settled in Egypt. Also, one theory holds that the city of Tanis in the Nile Delta might have had a garrison of sea peoples soldiers during the 11th century BC. While Egypt's empire shrank, it possibly hosted pockets of these peoples under controlled conditions. On the Anatolian side, a few decades after the collapse, new ethnic groups appear in historical records. The Phrygians, for example, are thought to have migrated into Anatolia, possibly from the Balkans, and by the 11th century BC established a kingdom in the former Hittite territory. Some have speculated that the Phrygians could be related to or descendants of some sea people's activity, perhaps the Mycenaeans or Bryges that Herodotus later links to Balkan migrations. Similarly, the Neo-Hittite states in southern Anatolia sometimes have kings with names that hint at continuity from the Hittite elite, but their populations might have absorbed some sea people settlers too. For instance, maybe some Sherden or Denyen ended up in Cilicia, Adana region, and became part of the local fabric. In the central Mediterranean, if Sherden indeed had links to Sardinia, one can consider the possibility that after 1200 BC, the Nuragic culture of Sardinia was influenced by returning mercenaries or migrants from the east. Sardinian bronze artifacts after 1200 BC show some influence from eastern Mediterranean styles, which could be due to Sherden involvement overseas. Likewise, Italy and Sicily around 1100 BC saw new cultures, Villanovan in Italy, Seychelles in Sicily. Some have wondered if the Teresh or Shekelesh who disappeared from the east reappeared as part of these Western cultures, for instance, maybe contributing to the eventual Etruscan civilization or Italic tribes. While speculative, it is a reminder that the movements of the sea peoples might have been part of a larger web of migrations affecting the whole Mediterranean. What's striking is that after the collapse, Many regions had forgotten how to write, at least temporarily. The loss of the palace bureaucracies meant linear B script vanished in Greece, cuneiform stopped in Ugarit and Hatti, and hieroglyphic use declined in Canaan. This contributed to a dark age mystique for the 12th to 10th centuries BC, but oral traditions kept the memories alive. The Homeric epics, for example, echo distant memories of Bronze Age events, like the Trojan War, which, if historical, might tie into these collapse wars. There is a hypothesis that the wanderings of peoples like the Sea Peoples are dimly remembered in later myths, such as the travels of Aeneas, a Trojan refugee, in Mediterranean lore, or the biblical story of the Israelites. Some elements of Exodus and the conquest of Canaan happen in a time of upheaval that could be connected. The dust eventually settled and a new Iron Age order emerged. The Phoenicians became the seafarers par excellence, since competitors like Ugarit were gone. The Israelites formed a kingdom in the highlands. The Aramaeans spread in Syria, and in the east the Assyrians and Babylonians recovered and later expanded. The Sea Peoples themselves vanish as a named entity after the early 11th century BC, but their offspring, literal or cultural, were part of these new nations. Over the past century and a half, the Sea Peoples have captured both scholarly attention and the popular imagination as one of history's great enigmas. Why did this coalition of tribes take to the sea and attack these lands? And were they conquerors, refugees, or both? Are questions that continue to be discussed. Our understanding of the Sea Peoples has evolved significantly, and lively debates persist in academic circles. Meanwhile, in popular media, the Sea Peoples are often depicted as almost legendary figures, the mysterious destroyers of civilizations, featuring in documentaries, books, and even video games. Academic debates, early scholarship, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, tended to cast the Sea Peoples as the prime movers of the Bronze Age collapse, essentially blaming them for the widespread destructions. This was influenced by the dramatic tone of Egyptian records and was championed by figures like Gaston Maspero, who coined the term Sea Peoples after studying those inscriptions. As more evidence came to light in the 20th century, scholars saw that the collapse was a complex phenomenon. By the late 20th century, a more nuanced view gained ground that the Sea Peoples were likely a symptom as much as a cause of the collapse. As one summary put it, now the Sea Peoples are accepted as a symptom of the collapse, not the origin point. In other words, their migrations might have been triggered by underlying problems, drought, famine, political turmoil, that were already bringing down the Bronze Age system. Eric Klein, author of 1177 BC. The year civilization collapsed, famously said, "The Sea Peoples are the big boogeymen of the Bronze Age collapse. I think they're part of it, but not the sole reason. I believe they're as much a symptom of the collapse as they were a cause." This encapsulates the current consensus that we shouldn't oversimplify the collapse to just invaders, but see the broader context. Supporting this, climate science and archaeology have provided evidence of long-term drought and earthquakes at the end of the Bronze Age, reinforcing the idea that environmental stress set the stage and the Sea Peoples took advantage of failing states. However, not everyone agrees fully on the symptom narrative. Some historians point out that Sea Peoples activity actually began before the collapse was in full swing. The Sherden raids in 1278 BC and the battles of 1208 BC show they weren't just a late-stage product. As noted in a recent 2025 analysis, the fact that Ramesses II fought Sea Peoples nearly a century before 1177 BC makes it clear that the raiding activities of the Sea Peoples were not a symptom of the Bronze Age collapse, but an ongoing process that likely contributed to weakening these civilizations. This view suggests a more active role. While drought and internal issues lit the fuse, the Sea Peoples might have been the hammer that delivered the final blows to certain kingdoms. In essence, modern scholarship is balancing these perspectives. The collapse was caused by multiple interlocking factors, with the Sea Peoples being one significant factor among others. The exact origins of each Sea People group remain debated. For example, were the Philistines mainly from one Aegean nation, or a mix? Evidence now points to a mix. Were the Sherden really Sardinian? The pottery evidence hints yes, but it's still debated if that means colonists from Sardinia or Sardinian-style mercenaries abroad. What about climate's role in driving them? Many agree a megadrought could have displaced populations, essentially turning farmers into raiders. climate refugees of a sort. One controversial hypothesis by a group called Luwian Studies even proposed that the whole narrative of sea peoples was essentially a story of the Luwians of western Anatolia rising and destroying their neighbors. This theory, pushing the idea that a lost Luwian civilization orchestrated the collapse, has not been widely accepted. Critics find it speculative and lacking evidence. Still, it shows the allure of trying to pinpoint a mastermind or central cause behind the sea peoples. Most scholars favor a more pluralistic view: multiple groups, multiple causes. Quotes from historians. Throughout this script, we've included some voices of historians and archaeologists. To highlight a few, Eric Klein's characterization of the collapse as a perfect storm of calamities is often cited, as is his line about the sea peoples being boogeymen, but not the sole culprits. Another historian, Robert Drews, once emphasized the violence of the period, writing, "Within a period of 40 to 50 years, almost every significant city in the eastern Mediterranean world was destroyed, many of them never to be occupied again." Drews argued a theory that changes in warfare, the rise of mass infantry armed with javelins and swords, made the old chariot-based armies obsolete, giving an edge to raiders like the sea peoples. His theory is one attempt to explain how relatively small bands could defeat large kingdoms by essentially outmoding them militarily. This remains debated, but it's an interesting military angle to the mystery. Archaeologist Aaron Mayer's quote in the Archaeology magazine 2022 is also illuminating. Understanding the Philistines as a singular, unified migratory group that came from somewhere in Greece, landed on the coast, and conquered Canaanite cities no longer makes sense. Their origins and development are much more complex. Mayer suggests the Philistines, and by extension other sea peoples, came in waves over decades and integrated with locals rather than in one blitzkrieg, which is a more nuanced migration model. These quotes show that the sea peoples are a topic where scholars must synthesize linguistic clues, archaeological finds, and even climatological data, and there's room for healthy disagreement. In conclusion, the Sea People's story is a compelling chapter of human history at the end of the Bronze Age, a time when climate stress, economic interdependence, and human migrations all intertwined to bring about a dramatic change. Whether we see them as destroyers or migrants, pirates or pioneers, the Sea Peoples illustrate how human societies respond to crisis, some by forging alliances and adapting, others by striking out in search of survival and opportunity. Their memory persisted in the records of those who fought them, and now, through archaeology, we are finally hearing echoes of their side of the story as well. The late Bronze Age world did collapse, but from its ashes new civilizations arose, and in those new societies one can trace the faint but crucial influence of the Sea Peoples and their travels. The mystery of the Sea Peoples is perhaps not fully solvable, but that only ensures we will continue to investigate and imagine this epic tale for years to come. As more evidence emerges, our picture of that chaotic age will keep evolving, much like the Sea Peoples themselves evolved from scattered tribes into a force that changed history.